Okay. Today's presentation, if everyone who isn't talking could just mute themselves, please. So today's presentation is on strategic bombing. It's kind of a new format that we're using because this is going to be a joint presentation with me and my father. So first, a disclaimer. This presentation does not constitute military advice. This presentation consists solely of personal opinions, baseless conjecture, and extraordinary hyperbole. This first photo that we have here is from the film Dr. Strangelove. It is a picture of Major Kong from Dr. Strangelove. Just a fun thing to set the mood.
That's very cool. I've never seen a picture before.
It's not directly moved from like the set. Yeah.
I mean, I get that it's not from a movie, but it's cool to see.
The overview of the presentation. First, we talk about the creation of the airplane itself, followed by bombing in World War I, then the interwar period, World War II, the Cold War, and now. Also, from the basic structure, I'll be addressing predominantly air theory, and then my dad will be going more into the specific on specific bombers and airframes. So the invention of the airplane itself, the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk in 1903. So that was the first heavier than air flight controlled heavier than air flight in human history. However, for quite some time, the Wright brothers themselves weren't really widely accepted in Europe. It wasn't really until 1908 that they actually flew in Europe, and European powers actually thought that they legitimately had achieved flight and weren't just some manner of huckster or fraudster who were trying to scam everyone into thinking that they actually achieved this flight. And this perception was really, you could see it in the fact that in 1907, the Hague Convention, which is a meeting on, what was considered like war, the laws of warfare, essentially. The 1907 Hague Convention, which was ratified by both the US and the United Kingdom, included Declaration 14, which prohibited the discharge of projectiles and explosives from balloons. This was specifically on lighter than aircraft because heavier than aircraft weren't even in military notice at this point. There's no military using heavier than aircraft at this point. However, the actual declaration itself could be more widely applied to, prohibiting the dropping of munitions from all aircraft, not just lighter than air aircraft, despite it being written for lighter than air aircraft. So that kind of, sets the perceptions prior to World War I. In World War I itself, air power really at the beginning of the war was not extensively developed. The use of air power in the terms of heavier than air aircraft was really just reconnaissance and scouting purposes. It really wasn't put into that much of an offensive role. There was, prior to the war, very limited offensive use of aircraft. I believe the Italians used it against the Turks, but really other than that, there wasn't much. There certainly wasn't wide-scale adoption of any type of heavier than air aircraft. So the first really use of bombing in warfare to a significant degree was in 1914 when a German airship flew over Antwerp and dropped bombs on the city of Antwerp. That's in Belgium. And this really opened up the use of bombing for both sides. By the end of the war, both sides were using bombing against targets. Really, though, this bombing was pretty significantly limited by both the aircraft that were available and the strategy at the time, because the war lasted from 1914 to 1918. And as I said before, the Wright brothers weren't widely accepted until 1908. So at the start of the war, the Wright brothers, their developments had been widespread for maybe 6 years. And by the end of the war, it was only about a 10-year-old invention. So, for us, that's newer than when the iPhone came into use in 2007. So you talk about a new military creation. It really was a new military creation, and there really wasn't a lot of thought on how you best use these types of platforms. Now I will go over to my dad, who will talk a little bit about the specifics of the German bombing campaign.
Good evening. One thing that I want to say too, a lot of people don't realize is the Wright brothers really had the patent on the airplane in the United States here until about 1908. And a lot of times people think to themselves, well, why didn't the Americans have better planes during World War One? And as Nathan mentioned, the Europeans didn't even start until 1908, basically. But look how far they went along in the first 4 to 5 years, and they were so far ahead of the Americans. The Americans designed the plane, but because of the patent, nobody else could actually make planes. So that's one of the reasons we were so far behind too. So I'll get into the German bombing campaign, and that started with the Zeppelins from Count von Zeppelin. He designed his first Zeppelin in about 1873. He was already had passenger flights in 1910, and the German bombing campaign used his Zeppelins. And by this time, I would say the Zeppelins were probably 350 to 400 feet long. And it started. They could only hold about 500 pounds of bombs. So it did damage, but not a lot of damage. But it started out as a terror campaign against the Triple Entente, or however you say that, states. And the bombs were limited to about 500 pounds. And the British developed anti-Zeppelin tactics, which are spotlights and incendiary rounds, which is kind of interesting. You can imagine something at about 5,000 or 6,000 feet. That's about as high as they would go for the bombing. That it was easy to shoot down. They did use anti-aircraft weapons, but they started first just shooting rounds of rifle fire. But the only thing is it didn't do much damage, and the British really came up with a thought of putting some sort of a chemical into the round, which became later tracer rounds. So the tracer rounds would set the hydrogen on fire. And they did this for most of the war years, and we'll go on to the next slide, not yet. But one thing about the Germans is it was a poor morale among the Zeppelin crews, simply because they were so easy to shoot down. You can imagine your best friends are on the next Zeppelin, it's shot down, and it goes down in a balling or in a ring of flame or whatever, with 20 men aboard, all falling. None of them had parachutes at the time. And how they got, which is kind of interesting, they used dead reckoning mainly in order to find London. But as we had already mentioned, it was mainly a morale part to break down the English to be scared of this. But we'll find out what happened next. So the Germans were ahead in a lot of aircraft, whether it be fighter planes or bombers. This is their best known bomber. It's called the Gotha GV bomber from 1917. Now this was higher speed of only about 20 miles an hour of a Zeppelin. Higher payload, 500 pounds to 800 pounds. It was more survivable simply because they could fly at 10 to 12,000 feet. It's a much smaller object to shoot and to get down. And it did have a shorter range though. Some of the Zeppelins could fly for like 10 hours. In fact, Zeppelins had one mission to the Mediterranean from the German, or the thing is, it was from the German border. One thing about the airplanes, it only had a range of 520 miles, which is about 260 miles one way. And one thing though that they did have is they had radio, or whatever you could call at that time, but they would use, it'd be like 2 points of radio, or they would take one radio station on one side, or a radio signal on the other, and then pinpoint it on London, and the bomber would follow those radio signals, and they had a pretty good way of finding London. And I just think I can't imagine flying in a steel frame with fabric and a little bit of metal, but it did, and great for those guys. They had a lot of bravery.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about the interwar theory itself. So, civilian and military leadership looking after World War I, they wanted to avoid the experience of World War I, because World War I was, on the Western Front at least, it was primarily defensive trench warfare with a significant loss of life with very little movement. So a lot of leadership, they want to avoid that type of experience. World War I was also in many ways a total war. So by a total war, it means that the war was more a test of strength between whole societies rather than a test of strength between two militaries. So one quote that I saw on Total War that I think was very applicable, and this was about World War I specifically, was that total war was a process of mutual exhaustion with defeat coming to the country that collapsed first. So it wasn't really about, your grand strategies. It wasn't about anything more than how much punishment could your society take compared to the society that you're fighting against. So the thought was that aircraft could be used to bypass the strong defenses that World War I established could result from a war, and attack directly into the social and industrial heart of a nation. So the part of this assumption too was that since total war was a mobilization of the entire society, civilians were just as legitimate of a military target as a military itself, because the thought was that since the war encompasses all of society, any part of society is a valid military target. That's kind of one of the key components of total war. And the thought was that your bombing, if it could strike directly industry and population, could induce a societal collapse by breaking the morale of your enemy's population. Because whereas a military could be trained in a way where it could accept significant losses, a civilian population doesn't have that same training. So the thinking at this time was that if you inflict enough punishment on a civilian population, they will capitulate. And this was called strategic bombing as opposed to just tactical bombing, because the thought was that this had strategic overview. Basically, you could achieve victory through air power alone, and air power itself could be your strategy. And this is really expressed through a quote from Stanley Baldwin, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, with his quote, "The bomber will always get through." And this really encapsulates a lot of thoughts from leadership and population at this time. That quote being, "It is well also for the man in the street to realize that there is no power on earth that can protect him from being bombed. Whatever people may tell him, the bomber will always get through. The only defense is in offense, which means that you have to kill more women and children more quickly than the enemy if you want to save yourselves." So this really expresses the thought that air power could be used to strike directly at populations. There is nothing that could be used to stop this air power, and therefore there's a heavy incentive to strike first at the enemy, because if you strike second, they'll probably cause you to collapse before you can break them. This is also expressed through the experience in Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. Spanish Civil War being between nationalist forces led by Francisco Franco that were backed by Italy and Germany, and Republican forces which were backed by the Soviet Union. So the Germans bombed a city in Spain called Guernica, and they killed a significant amount of civilians. They did a lot of destruction to the city itself, and there was a wide international reaction to this bombing, because in a lot of ways this was seen as a manifestation of what these air power theorists were talking about, and for a lot of people also foreshadowed potential future war. And at the top we have the famous painting from Picasso of Guernica itself to kind of illustrate the contemporary reaction as well. Now we'll go to some famous interwar designs.
Thanks. Nathan and I were talking about this the Germans used really the Spanish Civil War as kind of a testing ground for the products that they made. And we talked about a couple of planes, and these really had a factor later on also. And number one would be the first true dive bomber. You could have a vertical exactly 90 or whatever, straight 90 degrees or whatever from the bottom. And it had a 900-pound payload. Either there was like one 500-pound bomb, or I mean one 900-pound bomb, or maybe by itself, or maybe a 500-pound bomb with four 100-pound bombs, two on each wing. And one thing, as Nathan had talked about, was the fact of the fear factor. And this plane had the famous wailing siren that was attached to one of those wheels, or the struts that held the wheels up. And of course, as faster it went, the more the siren, it made a real screaming sound that would absolutely frighten everybody. And they would, and one thing about it, I give the pilots credit, because they would release their bomb at about 1,400 feet and then come out of that dive. And it was very accurate also, rather than just dropping bombs like 80 bombs out of one plane. They could just direct one. The next plane is the Heinkel HE-111 that was designed about a year before. And it was kind of described as the wolf in sheep's clothing, because it was based on a civilian airliner, and that's what the Germans did a lot because of the World War I restrictions that they had on them. And also, it's one of my favorite bombers. That's almost it's the distinctive German bomber for the Battle of Britain, which started in 1940, and it was also the most numerous German interwar plane that they made, and it roughly had about a 4,400 pound payload, and it was a medium bomber, and the bomb bay was directly in between, as normal, like any other bomber. And they learned a lot about tactics and everything else. One thing interesting is, if you look at planes from that era that fought in the Civil War, they didn't have the swastikas or the Iron Cross, but they're usually their tail rudder was painted a leather. It was a lighter color with an X, and that was the same thing. They had squares on their wings with X's on them. And those are the two planes that really showed the Germans were really good at building planes at that time. And next is the American interwar designs. I really like the plane on the left. That is a Boeing B-9 that was developed in 1931. And that was the first all-metal monoplane bomber and that also was an airline refit. And it had about a 2,200 pound payload. And one thing that I like about this is there's 5 men aboard. There's a right up in front in the nose is a machine gunner. The second person is the co-pilot bombardier. The first is the co-pilot bombardier. The second is the pilot, and then there's 2 machine gunners. And I just think that's a cool looking plane. And if I had a chance to fly, I'd love to do that, because I can't imagine flying in an open cockpit, because that had a 12, let me see here. It could fly to almost 20,000 feet. So I would assume it would be pretty cold up there. And the bomber that was designed after the B-9, there's quite a difference, was the bomber on the right, which is the B-17 Flying Fortress. That was designed about 3 years later, and that was designed for daylight bombing. And that had a 4,500 pound payload, and that was for short or for long missions. And for long missions, or for short missions, you could have about 8,000 pounds of bombs. And roughly between 1935 and 1945, there were 12,900 of those produced, which was one of the most produced American airplanes. And it did have a ceiling, though, of 35,600 feet, and it cruised at 182 miles an hour. And one thing about this, too, is we'll find out when we talk about the B-29, this is still, I would assume it was pretty cold. I know I had heard it was like minus 40 or 50 degrees. They wore, every one of there were 13 crew members. They all wore electronically heated flight suits and also had to have an oxygen mask on the whole trip. And we'll get into the reasons why that changed later. Thanks.
Yeah, so once World War II started, the war did not start with the air-based hyper-offensive that air power theorists had speculated. Instead, it opened with maneuver-based warfare that was pretty contrary to what happened in World War I. And a lot of this was that both sides failed to have either aircraft or weapons that could utilize the offenses that air power theorists wanted. Neither side had, even if they wanted to, the capability of doing significant damage to cities at the beginning of the war. Also, air defenses were significantly more capable than people, or that the air power theorists thought. They didn't anticipate, high performance fighters with radar guiding in order to go after bombers. And then also a civilian population was just fundamentally a lot more resilient than people thought. Instead of civilian populations turning over the instant that their cities were bombed, they proved to either get pretty angry or just to not care when they were being bombed significantly, which really didn't match the expectations of air power theorists. However, one thing to consider about the air power theorists from the interwar period is that they were, or many of them at least, were individuals who were promoting why there should be an independent Air Force free from, Army control or whatever branch controlled the Air Force at that time, depending upon the country. So a lot of these air power theorists, kind of overplayed what the benefits of an Air Force would be because they wanted to get, influence, prestige, and an independent Air Force. So a lot of their estimations pre-war were not really empirically based, they were speculation.
Okay, now we come to the B-29 Superfortress. This is, it first came into use about in 1944. It was designed originally in 1938, but this is truly the first modern American bomber. And what I mean by modern is it had a pressurized cabin. No longer did you have to have an electronically heated suit with face masks. You could basically board it in your civil or in your, I guess the military would call them civvy clothes or whatever. They're basic tan shirts and pants or whatever. And they could fly up to 30,000 feet. And one of the things too, since it came out, you wonder why it took so long. Well, there were very many problems with its engines. They were Pratt & Whitney engines, but they were two cylinder banks of 8 cylinders each. So each engine was 16 cylinders, and they had a lot of heating problems. So the nacelles or whatever covers the engines had to be redesigned many times. They finally got that figured out, and that was in 1944. And one thing, it was never flown in Europe. It was mainly flown against the Japanese Empire, and that allowed the bombing of Japan from distant Pacific bases. But originally, I don't know if you read much about this, but originally Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Army Air Corps bombers, they started out flying out of India, and they bombed. They flew over the Himalayas, over China, and then bombed a lot of the Japanese cities. The problem with that was getting over, or the distance factor, and also getting over the mountains. A lot of planes didn't return. So when the Americans did get, when they did conquer Guam and Tinian, they set up bases there, which was only about 1,500 miles away, which was the effective range. So they had somewhat a little bit of time. If they did miss a city or whatever, they could look for a second city and then fly back safely. It did have a payload of 10,000 pounds of bombs, and they were also used in massed bomber formations. And it was quite an upgrade of a plane. And it was used yet by the Americans until the early 1950s.
Yeah, and with the B-29, you can really see how the Air Force and civilian leadership are trying to move things more in the direction that the interwar theorists wanted, which was mass formations of bombers able to go long distances with a lot of weapons. So even though they couldn't do that at the beginning of the war, they're kind of starting to move it in that direction.
One thing too that I didn't add, there were 4 different machine gun stations. You can see those little cylinders on the bottom picture. You can see it towards the tail with a machine gun hanging out. On the top picture, you can see it before the tail on top. This is the first plane that had a computer that one person controlled all 4 through a site, which was computer that everything that he did, it worked all 4 of the machine gun stations or whatever at the same time. So I'm sure it wasn't the kind of computer we have, but it was a computer.
Okay, here we have a fun picture of, if you look, this looks a lot like the B-29. It is, you look at the general shape of the fuselage, everything like that. It effectively looks like a clone of the B-29, but you see it has a red on the tail. This is actually my dad was talking about how B-29 crews, they had damaged planes, they couldn't get back to the air base, and they had to bail out in Soviet territory. So by the end of the war, the Soviets actually had 3 or 4 completed B-29s, and they completely reverse engineered these planes to the point where, even though the Soviets, for the gauge of aluminum, because they wanted everything to be exactly the same, like to the point where they needed to file paperwork to use Soviet parachutes for the crew if they wanted to bail out, because they wanted everything to be exactly the same as the B-29. So there was after the end of the war, there was an air parade where Western analysts were seeing the planes flying over, and they saw a couple of what looked like B-29s. They figured it was just the ones that the Soviets captured, and then eventually more and more started flying over, and they realized that the Soviets had reverse engineered the plane. So strategic bombing was really used to the greatest effect in World War II in the Pacific theater against Japan. And the original plan was to use the B-29 for high altitude raids, because high altitude raids were much more difficult for defenses to intercept. However, this is a pretty ineffective tactic due to the fact that Japan has very strong prevailing winds. So any bomber flying at high altitude, there'd be very low accuracy for the bombs that they dropped. So Curtis LeMay, who my dad mentioned earlier, who was an Air Force general at this time and would later become the head of the Strategic Air Command that was in charge of Air Force nuclear weapons, he shifted the Air Force strategy over to firebombing, which is you fly many planes at lower altitude and you drop incendiary weapons, predominantly armed with the type of napalm, in order to burn the Japanese cities. And this was, most prominently used on the 10th of March, 1945 against Tokyo, where 325 B-29s were used in this raid that left over 100,000 dead, over 1 million homeless, and burned 16 square miles of Tokyo. So if you look at the picture on the left, that's not hit from Hiroshima or Nagasaki, that's from Tokyo after the air raid. And this is actually the single deadliest and the single most destructive air raid in World War II. It was more destructive than either the bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki individually. So that's, just something to consider when you think about why did the US use nuclear weapons. In a lot of ways, it wasn't fundamentally different from other methods of warfare that the US was using at this time. Really, the biggest difference was that the nuclear weapons could present all this damage with one plane and one bomb, as opposed to mass bomber formations. And here we have a map from a magazine just after World War II, where they have US cities with a Japanese city of an equivalent size, and then the percent of that city that was destroyed by US bombing during the war. So, if you look at, those of you familiar with Grand Rapids, the Japanese city Kumamoto, 31% of it was destroyed. San Jose, similar in size to Shimizu, 42% destroyed. New York, similar in size to Tokyo, 40% destroyed. So you just talk about, the absolute destruction that the bombing had on Japan from our air campaign, and kind of, putting it into a US perspective. However, everything really did change with the introduction of nuclear weapons. Hiroshima bombing on the left, Nagasaki bombing on the right, in that it presented a single weapon that could present all of this damage. So here we have a picture of Curtis LeMay, who again was really one of the big Air Force nuclear weapons proponents. Those of you who have seen my previous presentation on nuclear weapons may recognize him. He was really big in the adoption of Air Force nuclear strategy. So after World War II, air power theorists basically admitted, hey, we weren't right in the lead up to World War II about how much damage you could do to a city with bombers. However, they said nuclear weapons change everything. Nuclear weapons give us the ability to realize a lot of this interwar theory. We can finally destroy cities in the magnitude that we envisioned. So a lot of these air power theorists made new claims about, how nuclear weapons would affect bombing. The first one was that all future major wars would be fought using nuclear weapons. They basically said, there's no reason to have large standing armies and navies because nuclear weapons will, define all future major conflict. They also said that nuclear weapons had that ability to realize that hyperoffensive air victory, as we said before, that offense would dominate defense. And this goes back to the thought that the bomber will always get through. In the 1930s and 1940s, before nuclear weapons, if you had 300 bombers and there was a significant defense, because think about Japan. When we were bombing them, they were in many ways a broken country. They couldn't really give a significant defense to our air raids. So the thought was, even if the bomber gets through, if you're using conventional weapons, if 10% of the bombers can get through, 10% of the bombers using conventional weapons probably won't really be able to do that much damage by themselves. The fact that the bomber will always get through is kind of irrelevant if you're talking about conventional weapons. However, the thought here is if you're talking about nuclear weapons, if you're talking about a bunch of bombers and one gets through, but that one is carrying nuclear weapons, that single bomber getting through can still, destroy a city. So the thought was, there is no defense at this point. So, their bottom line up front was we should devote all effort to new bombs and new bombers because this will define future conflict, which really shapes, this next design that we'll talk about.
And that would be the B-36 Peacemaker. This is from, it was first in action in 1948. It was designed originally in about 1941. And as we had talked before with the bombers, every bomber had a higher range, a distance range. This could go up to 40,000 feet. And one of the reasons is interceptors. They tried to keep ahead of the interceptors or the fighter planes, that the bombers would get to 30,000 feet, so they would design a fighter that would get to 30,000 feet. So the bombers always had to keep one step ahead. This plane could fly to almost 40,000 feet, and it was designed for a nuclear strike. You can see the two. I think it's interesting. The B-36 on the left is just by itself, but there it's the B-36 is the plane on the right. And the plane on the left is the B-29. And the B-29 was one monster plane when it was designed. And look at the difference between the two. And that's only a difference of about 3-4 years that they could develop such a thing. The plane had six piston engines and 4 jets, which is 2 on each wing. And the nickname for it was 6 turning and 4 burning. And it was designed to hold atomic bombs, as I had said before, designed for intercontinental flight without refueling. It could fly basically 40 hours without stopping and or without landing again. So it could travel 20 hours one way and then 20 hours back. And it was designed to fly above interception altitudes, which were the fighter planes. And as I'd mentioned before, they had a lot of problems with the engines. It was a brand new engine. It was 2 banks of 8, as I had mentioned. And it was used basically from 1949 to about 1959. And the cruise speed was about 230 miles an hour. Max was 435. That was probably without bombs. And it was obsolete, though, by about 1950 because MiG jets, they could reach them by that time. It had a crew of 13 also. Neat looking plane. Next is the
I have a
B-52.
question.
And here a minute.
Dad, someone has a question.
Oh, yes.
Was the B-36? That was the one in the movie Strategic Air Command, right?
Right. That was with Jimmy Stewart and June Allison.
It's the one with the little tunnel where the crew has to go through on like a skid board to get from the front to the back.
Right. That was the same as it was the same as the B-29 too, because the front of the airplane was pressurized, the tunnel was, and aft. So the bomb bay wasn't. And the B-39 or the B-36 followed the B-29 with that same thing. You know, the story in regards to that story, that was a story of a ball player, Monty Allen or something like that. He played for the Cardinals, I believe, and suddenly he was drafted when the Korean War started. So I went on YouTube and I just looked at a few little snippets. You know, you can, and it's an all-color film too, which is really nice. I think it was from 1953, but they really featured the B-20 or the B-36. So if you want to get an idea how big it was inside, they even had a little place to make lunches and everything, like a little restaurant, or I don't want to say quite a restaurant, but like a little kitchen.
A galley.
A galley, correct. And that's a neat looking plane. Next is the B-52. This replaced the B-36, but this is America's first all-jet bomber. And that also was designed for a nuclear strike. It was designed for subsonic jet flight. So it had a cruising speed of about 500 miles or 580 miles an hour. It was designed too for intercontinental flight, which is long range also. But it also had a similar payload, but a longer range, but twice the speed of a B-36. And that is the advantage of a jet aircraft. And this was one of the first planes that they used for midair refuel. So it had a longer range without stopping. And what's kind of funny though is the first refueling tanker was a converted B-29. So that plane had to go from 580 miles an hour to about 220. And they're still being used. Just for a fact, 744 total B-52s were made, and that was the B-52A through the B-52H. So every letter had a different variant or a new modification. And the last model was the H model, and the last H model built was in 1962. So of the 744, there's 76 H models still in use. which is amazing. That's from 1962. So that's almost as old as I am. So one thing about it, the bomb load was 70,000 pounds, and that could be mixed ordnance also. So its range was basically about 2,500 miles one way. So it had a range of about 5,000 miles. And I know Nathan asked me this, since it's being used, why is it so long lasting? You know, why is this plane still being used? Well, the Air Force still plans on using it until 2050. So that's another 30 years or 29 years. And one thing is it's a very rugged plane, and it's a simple plane, or the simplicity of it. And it's versatile because it can hold gravity bombs, cluster bombs, sea mines, cruise missiles, and it's not stealthy, but works best when air superiority is established. So this plane does not carry now anymore. It did at one time, but it will not carry nuclear bombs. That is for other planes now. That is in the Air Force inventory. But it's kind of like it's when there's not a lot of competition, they use this plane, and it can heavier bomb loads and everything else. It's really a versatile plane. It does look different now. It has radar on the front. I asked Nathan to get this one because this is the original. I like that, or the looks of that better. Now it has a long tail on the end with radar equipment also. And does anybody know why they painted the bottom of the planes white?
Just blend in better with the sky or anything?
Probably that, but also it was flash paint. So when the bomb exploded, it would reflect.
Specifically for nuclear weapons.
Yeah. So that's one thing that I learned from this. I never knew this before, or I never knew that before. And this is the copy. I'll try my best. The Meneshchev.
Pat knows Russian. How do you pronounce that?
I don't know. It's Cyrillic. Myashashev?
Yeah, Myashashev. The Russians built this. This is about the same size as a B-52, where the B-52 had 4 jet pods of 2 engines apiece under the wings. They had 4 engines, 2 on each side, where the wing meets the fuselage. And from their Korean War experiences, Russia needed a bomber that could compete with the speed and the altitude or that could get higher than what the jet fighters. That's always been the basic thing, is always get higher than either later on it became missiles or it was the jet fighters. But this was intended to strike the US, so it could fly. That also had a range roughly the same as a B-52. It could reach the US and get back. So again, similar range and small, but it had a smaller payload than the B-52. It's also the first Soviet jet bomber. And this had a little bit lower ceiling than the B-52, about 36,000 feet. And but it could cruise to about the same speed, about 558 miles an hour. And this version that you see here was this way until the early 60s, and then they modified it a bit after that for a few years. And we'll look at later on what the next bomber is.
Yeah, and it talks about the bomber gap as well. The bomber gap was, in the 50s, U.S. Intelligence was looking at the number of bombers, trying to estimate how many the Soviets had. And the Soviets had a pretty limited inventory of M4s. I don't think they ever built more than about 30 or 40 of them, but they always like paraded them around and used them in exhibition and shows and parades and things like that. So the fact that the Soviets were using like 30 of these bombers for parades and shows made the US think that they must have had significantly more of the bombers, hundreds of these bombers. So the US thought that, they had hundreds of these bombers, which is why the Air Force kept pushing for us to build more and more bombers, and they keep maintaining a bomber inventory because of that misunderstanding of how many bombers the Soviets actually had. Operation Chrome Dome was kind of, this bomber theory put into practice. It was a route that you can see, goes from Greenland down to, maybe Kansas. And this was a route that B-52s were constantly in the air from 1960 to 1968. There was always some number of B-52s in the air. When one B-52 landed, another one took off, and that shows the importance of offense. The thought that we need bombers in the air because if we're struck first, we don't know what's coming. We might not have the ability to strike back. Ultimately, this was phased out due to missiles. In a lot of ways, a lot of these nuclear bombing roles were phased out in favor of missiles because missiles are a lot more survivable. You don't need to maintain crews. You can kind of just have them sitting around until they need to be used. Now we're going to look at some other foreign designs. Here we have the Avro Vulcan, which was the predominant British strategic bomber during the Cold War. And this was originally used for high altitude flight and then later changed to low altitude flight for reasons that we'll talk about. But this was significantly smaller than US bombers in that the British, they still wanted this to be capable of, using conventional weapons, but it was still predominantly a nuclear bomber. So they didn't feel like they needed quite as much payload because nuclear weapons could be pretty effectively miniaturized.
Nate?
Compare that, yes.
Nathan?
Yes.
The Vulcan, which is kind of interesting too about that, is if you're familiar with the James Bond films, the fourth or fifth was Thunderball, and that's when Spectre, the film, starts out. The bombers, I always liked anything British anyway, but they always had cool uniforms and nice looking jets and so forth. But the movie starts out inside the cockpit of this, and one of the co-pilots happens to be joined Spectre, which is the anti-good guy, or they were the bad guys. So what they did is he put on he had something attached to the oxygen mask that the British pilots, when he turned the switch, they were knocked out or whatever, and he flew the bomber into the Caribbean. And what I thought was kind of neat is he landed it in the water, and it made those wings made a perfect, there was enough room that it just kind of skidded. Of course, this is the movie. So when it stopped, it sank. And so what happened then is he, of course, had his skin diving stuff. He escaped through the canopy, and then the Spectre could get the atomic bomb, which they wanted out of that plane. But that was featured in that movie. Just thought you'd
Yes, if you want to see this bomber in a movie, check out whichever James Bond film that
Thunderball.
is.
It's Thunderball. Yeah.
That's opposed to the French nuclear weapon designs, where this is the Dassault Mirage 4. The French didn't really design their bombers to do conventional conflict at all. It was really only to do penetration strikes with nuclear weapons. So you can see this looks pretty much like a heavy fighter. This doesn't look like a conventional or a traditional bomber. And this because the French really only wanted a plane that could penetrate airspace and deliver nuclear weapons and nothing else. The US designed the XB-70 in order to replace the B-52. The thought was that Soviet interceptors are getting more capable, so we need a plane that can fly even higher than those interceptors. The thought also was that we need a plane that can go supersonic. The thought was basically that as the plane got into Soviet air defenses, the Soviets would scramble their fighters. However, this plane is so fast that be outside of air detection range by the time the planes were able to get into the air. So it's so fast to basically be able to outrun defenses. However, the U-2 shoot down in the 60s with Francis Gary Power kind of, prompted some concerns about this bomber. Predominantly the thought that a surface air missile shot down a U-2 spy plane, which is thought to be outside of the range of interception. So, this prompted a lot of concerns about maybe these other designs that we're trying to put forward could be shot down too. So because of this, a lot of bomber theory shifted from we'll fly really high and fast to we'll fly so low that we're below radar coverage and we can fly in between radar coverage zones. However, the B-70 design could not be adapted to this changed role because it had very low payload. Which, this payload both expressed in the fact that the fuel tanks were very small and, it had much better fuel economy. It was flying at high altitude than low altitude. So if it was flying at low altitude, it would not have a very effective range, and it couldn't be adopted to conventional conflict because of the low payload. There's, at this point, realization that our bombers shouldn't be used only for conventional munitions, for nuclear weapons, but should also be available for conventional munitions, which the B-70 couldn't be adopted for. So yeah, the B-52, however, had large fuel tanks, was a very versatile platform, as my dad was talking about. So the B-52 was able to take over that low penetration role. So the B-70 was never really widely adopted. Operation Rolling Thunder kind of represented the attempts to use conventional bombing campaigns. It was used during the Vietnam War. It was a attempt to destroy North Vietnamese morale and industry using conventional bombing. And the amount of bombs they used was really a pretty astronomical amount. They, in fact, used more bombs in Operation Rolling Thunder North Vietnam than used in the entire Pacific theater throughout World War II. However, despite the huge amount of munitions they used, this was really a strategic failure. And there's a lot of debate as to why exactly it was a strategic failure. Some say that the Air Force wasn't allowed to choose enough targets for fear of escalating the war into including the Soviet Union or China. And others say there was really just a fundamental failing of strategic bombing itself. But either way, strategic bombing did not work in this way, and it did not break the North Vietnamese people.
Okay, the B-1 Lancer. This was designed after the failure of the XB-70, simply because, as Nathan had mentioned, ICBMs were a lot cheaper and more effective than fighter planes, plus they could reach that high. So this was designed for high speed but low altitude penetration bombing, and the speed was supersonic, but it was a terrain hugging plane. So it used radar. It kept below the radar angle or whatever. And this was also a variable winged airplane. This is in its cruise, or this is in its its slower speed. Once it attained supersonic speed, the wings would fold back. And it's still in use, and it's been adapted to, like the B-52. It can use a lot more conventional bombs than what it was designed for. And so it was contentious during the development. There was a lot of those that it was like going a step backward somewhat from the XB-70, but it's still in use today. It no longer carries nuclear bombs, but it has done an admirable job for being a low. There weren't very many built, and the range though is about 5,100 miles, and so it'd be about 2,600 miles one way. And it also has a crew of 4, and it's a nice looking plane too.
Nathan, did one of those fly over a Michigan game? Do you remember? I feel like one did, but
I know for sure a B-2 flew over.
well, I remember that one. I'm not going to forget that one, but I think there was one where about 4 planes flew over, and the big one was one of these. But I
okay, that very well could have been. I mean, that's like a big thing where what they do is they take planes that are already on training missions, and they basically divert them to whatever game's going on at the time. And bombers have such a long range that they can really get them wherever they want. But it's a very 1970s plane, in that every plane built in the 70s had a variable wing if they were going to have a fast flight, which we'll actually see with the next plane.
Maybe it was a different variable wing plane. I don't know, but I think I remember one. I know that this one's huge, the B-1.
Well,
Okay, so
that's
it probably
just-
was not this that I saw at the Michigan game.
Hopefully not.
I think I may have seen one of those planes. I remember there were 4 planes from the Air Force that flew over one of the Michigan games that I was at.
Yeah, I've seen those in Fort Worth at the Lockheed factory. The elite ones. Nice.
Well, the next plane is the Tupolev T-160. It's been in service since 1987. And this was in response to the American B-1 for its looks and the XB-70 for its speed. So this was a variable wing plane also. And this was the last Soviet designed bomber. There were only 36 built, and 9 were testing, and 27 were in service. And one thing, this is the fastest, the heaviest, largest combat aircraft with very variable, I can never say that, variable swept wing ever flown as of 2021. And again, when missiles took over in what this was designed for, it became somewhat obsolete. And that's one thing, if we go back to the B-1, that still is in use, even though in some ways it wasn't designed for exactly what they're doing with it now. Oh, by the way, this is quite a fast plane too. This plane can go 1,380 miles an hour at 40,000 feet.
Yeah, so most Soviet bombers were actually turboprops by the number that they built. They never really mass produced a jet bomber, and that's because they relied pretty heavily on missile strike capability, as my dad was talking about. When it came to conventional conflict, they figured that they just used turboprops. And really, the Tupolev T-160 was kind of odd in respect to Soviet bombers, but it was also a very late Cold War design. And next we have the B-2 Spirit, which is commonly known as the stealth bomber. I know Robert and I have seen these in person during the Michigan Air Force game. So it has low radar observability, and it's designed to penetrate Soviet airspace by not being detected by their radar. And it's a subsonic flying wing. The flying wing gives it a greater range due to the fact that has just less drag overall and less components on it that are exposed. And a flying wing is also advantageous for low observability or stealth flight because it has no vertical surfaces. I mean, you look at even the air intakes, they're rounded with no vertical surfaces, and really vertical surfaces are the part of a plane with the largest radar cross section. The real downside to this plane was that it costs about $2 billion per airframe, which, I mean, you talk about, that's like submarine tier in terms of cost without the flexibility and constant operation that a submarine can utilize. So there were a lot of questions once the Soviet Union collapsed why this plane should be used. And that 1997 isn't when it first flew; it was really when it was first put into wider service. Next, we have a plane that might look a little familiar based on what we just saw, and this is the Northrop Grumman B-49. The B-49 was a flying wing jet designed shortly after World War II by Northrop Grumman. Northrop Grumman was the same company that designed the B-2. And this plane actually had the same wingspan as a B-2, coincidentally. So, I guess Northrop Grumman dusted off the old designs when they were asked to make a flying wing design for the Air Force. And, the fundamental failure of this plane was that it was very difficult to control, particularly if it stalled. It basically went into an uncontrolled dive that no human pilot could get out of. That was really one of the advantages of the B-2, is that it existed in the time of microelectronics that could provide a lot of the stability in the plane that a human simply could not do by themselves.
Fly by wire, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I've never heard of this plane before. This reminds me a lot of Convergent Evolution. I know it's the
same company, though.
It's the same designer or what have you, but just the idea that there are only so many different plane designs that you can have. And
yep. Well,
so
speaking of, there are only so many plane designs you can have. We're not going to talk about the next bomber that's supposed to be introduced, the B-21 Raider. This is designed to augment and replace aging designs, designed for both conventional and deep penetration nuclear strike. Specifics are not known. It's thought that maybe it will hit wider Air Force use and be put into service in the late 2020s. But speaking to Robert's claim about there are only so many designs, that's one thing that you can kind of see about a lot of military design, is that for a lot of military design, we've kind of figured out what works. And everything at this point is just making minor modifications on what we know works, instead of, you talk about during World War II or the early Cold War, and it was, a major new platform with major design changes every 5 years or something like that. And, this plane looks pretty similar to a plane that came out, more than 40 years ago. So what's the future of air power? Fundamentally, the effectiveness of strategic bombing is hotly debated. Just in the fact that a lot of the underpinning for strategic bombing was never really empirically based. And now that we have empirical evidence, it doesn't really look like strategic bombing works the way that air power theorists might claim. And then you talk about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have only been used twice in hostilities. They're used against a broken or a shattered nation, against Imperial Japan. So it's really hard to garner what the actual effects of using a nuclear weapon on an adversary would be as well, if you want to talk about lack of empirical data. However, the empirical data that does exist suggests that at least for conventional strategic bombing, that is bombing against population industry, it is not effective. Because low and medium intensity strategic bombing just makes your adversary's population mad. They just are mad that their house was destroyed, that their family was killed, and they want revenge. And then high intensity strategic bombing just gives way to apathy. So not like a desire to stop fighting, but just a desire of, I guess this is what life is like now. I guess we're just going to have to live with constant bombing raids. There's not really anything we can do about it, which is basically the situation of Imperial Japan at the end of World War II. Also, economies are significantly more robust and capable of being dispersed than air power theorists originally thought. A lot of the original theory was assuming you were attacking a peacetime economy. However, the experience of bombing Nazi Germany was that German production was actually at its highest point at the end of the war, despite the bombing, because of the fact that they put their industry underground. They focused only on crucial war industries. So even though a significant portion of their economy was destroyed, they could still supply enough for their war effort. Therefore, the question is, what is the most effective use of air power? And it's not necessarily strategic bombing. The thought is the most effective use of air power is actually theater air power. That is, ground strike, for example. And that's because it can be used in something called a hammer and anvil strategy, which is a combined arms combining land forces with air forces, with the air force being the hammer, the land forces being the anvil. The thought is you use your land forces as the anvil, which is you direct enemy forces into certain corridors where they are exposed to air power, and then you bomb them relentlessly once they're in an exposed position. And you can see the picture on the left is the highway of death from the first Gulf War, which is basically we forced the Iraqi army into a retreating position, and then as they were retreating on their highways, we just relentlessly bombed their highways that they were retreating on, and effectively destroyed whatever military capacity that they had left. So that's kind of the future of air power. That's not something that you talk about what is the most significant parts of the Air Force. It's really the fighters and the bombers. The Air Force has wanted to phase out ground strike combat for quite some time. They've never really liked the fact that they have to, fly the A-10, that they have to fly the F-35 in ground strike. But really, that's probably the most effective use of air power. Certainly you want to maintain strategic bombers for a deterrence effect, but the actual, how effective is, flying the B-1 or the B-2 or whatever else, at least the evidence suggests that it's not incredibly effective. And to that, have any questions? Here we have the B-52, the B-1, and the B-2 all in flight together.
Over Michigan?
I don't think so.
No. Well, that was north.
I Googled it. I don't think there was ever a B-1 that flew over. I think I'm just imagining things. I have a question about the future of air power. I'm hearing a lot about private military contractors these days, PMCs, you might call them. Do they have any air power? Is that a thing that could become a thing?
Well, not that I'm really aware of. I think that like,
It's probably just due to budget, right?
yeah, I mean, aircraft cost a lot of money to maintain. Like a B-52 is considered cheap, and it's like $20,000 per hour to run it.
Any like repurposed crop dusters? You hear anything about
Well,
that?
I mean, I think that like you talk about like drones are kind of in the vogue. They can be used for like limited ground strike. At least now, there aren't really a lot of like air superiority drone designs that I know about or would talk about at least. But you talk about like a Reaper or a Predator drone. Those are pretty slow. But they can be used pretty cheaply. There's an article I read recently that I thought it was a pretty flawed premise. It was saying drones aren't actually saving us money because they're so much cheaper to use that we're using them a lot more, which means that they cost the same amount to use. But it's like, we're getting a lot more out of it for the cost, though, if we're flying them a lot more. So isn't that still like, maybe it's not a lower total cost, but certainly better cost effectiveness? I don't know, but that's not really here or there. But that's kind of like the way it's going. And drones are not considered highly desirable within the military either. I don't think there are a lot of people that they go in wanting to be a drone pilot, whereas a lot of people do want to be a bomber pilot, or they do want to be a fighter pilot.
I was asking because I was thinking of a certain favorite son, you might say, of Holland, Michigan, who repurposed a couple of crop dusters for military purposes and got in a spot of trouble.
Oh, well, I know that like you talk about the big F-35 opponent, Pierre Spray, and he thinks that we should take the P-51 Mustang and have our Air Force fly those because that costs even less to fly. So
that's when theory, the air power theory, goes a little too far.
Well, he's so like you can tell when an F-35 article isn't well written if they reference Pierre Spray.
Absolutely.
I read a really good, really nuanced article about the F-35 recently, actually from the New York Times, and they didn't mention Pierre Spray once, which was like an automatic.
No,
they at least aren't falling for like War is Boring or some other like military blog.
The context to bring up Pierre Spray is to like say there's a lot of this BS going on in the corner, basically, of people with very loud mouths and whatnot. But anyways, the Eric Prince, his crop dusters with machine guns, I believe, were spotted flying over Libya and a number of other countries kind of in Africa. So that's all I know about that.
I think we should bring back the Zeppelin.
Yeah.
I know that someone in the military somewhat recently was designing some sort of high altitude blimp to be used for like reconnaissance and surveillance, not for bombing or anything like that.
They use those a lot in I guess you kind of got into that, but for reconnaissance and whatnot in earlier wars, right?
Yeah, World War II. I mean, you talk about like the Navy used to have blimps that they would run out of hangars in like New Jersey or something like that, and they would use
like
it
hot air
for
balloons in the Civil War. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, for like basic observation.
Okay.
Right. Well, what changed with the blimp or the Zeppelin was in 1886 a couple of German engineers designed the internal combustion engine. And once they had that, it wasn't a matter of the blimp being on ropes held on the ground or chains or whatever, or just going wherever. Like if you see a hot air balloon, it just goes wherever the wind takes it. So when they had an engine that created thrust that you could either go, forward in a specific way, that's when the Zeppelin really came. It really came in its own. And like I mentioned, Zeppelin already had by about 1893 or whatever, he had a pretty neat looking blimp that was maneuverable, and that changed warfare too. But at that time, they would just drop bombs from the basket or whatever, just by hand.
Just have them sitting at their feet and they just throw them overboard.
Just throw them overboard and hope it hits something.
Any other questions?
So hope you enjoyed it. Nathan and
Yes,
I talked about
I
it.
have
and,
I have one other question, and I mean, you I think you addressed this, but maybe not in a
Okay.
huge amount of detail, because I think the focus was strategic bombing, but I think throughout there's been other using planes for war, mostly shooting down other planes or whatnot. But what is the status of air forces like present day? Like, we don't see many plane battles, dogfights, whatever these days. Like,
Well,
what's going on right now?
That's probably, well, we kind of do. It's just that our adversaries that we've gone against, I mean, like you look at Vietnam War and Korean War, there were significant air engagements throughout the duration of it. And a lot of that was because either the Soviets or the Chinese basically lent both platforms and pilots.
Mhm.
Since that time, though, I mean, like the Gulf War, the Iraqis had an air force. The thing is, ours was so overwhelming, we established air superiority effectively in like a day or something like that. And then, it's really just a matter of our air force is so overwhelming and our adversaries are so low level that our air force basically goes in with the assumption that they'll get air superiority almost immediately.
Mhm.
Whereas, that's kind of a question about, potential conflict against near peer adversaries in that they could potentially have areas that not only would we not have air superiority, but they could also have areas that are contested in that it's like 50-50 in controlled territory, or even there could be areas where an adversary maintains air superiority. And you talk about like drones or bombers that are relatively old, like a B-52 or a B-1, they aren't designed for modern warfare. They're designed for areas where it's uncontested airspace. So that's really, why the Air Force is investing in like the B-21 is so that you can have a bomber that can operate in contested airspace. And that was the intention of, that was really the intention of all of these bombers when they were new, but as they became older, they eventually just couldn't operate in that type of area.
Great, thanks. That answers my question.